Okay, let's now work through an entire example of a company utilizing process costing and specifically utilizing the weighted average method. And we are going to look specifically at one single work in process department. Okay? Kellogg Company has produced Eggo waffles since 1970, and they have 3 departments that produce these waffles. The first department is the mixing department. The second department is the baking department, and the third department is freezing and packaging. The mixing department combines the dry ingredients, including the flour, the salt, the baking powder, with liquid ingredients, including eggs and vegetable oil, in order to make the waffle batter. Here is the information regarding the mixing department and the number of units that were already in production from the prior period, plus what was started in this period, and then what was finished in this period, and what still remains in work in process in the mixing department. All right, so let's take a look at the data. Regarding physical units, these are actual quantities or physical pieces of waffle, okay? This is not the equivalent units. This is actual physical quantity units. All right, so we've got work in process June 1, 100,000 waffles. Where did this work in process 100,000 waffles come from? This is waffles that were still in process in the mixing department in May. Okay, so at May 31st, 11:59 p.m., there were still some waffles being mixed up. 100,000 waffles worth of mix. All right, so it would still be here at 12:01 a.m. on June 1st. We started into production another 800,000 waffles in the month of June. Okay, so we added in direct materials for 800,000 more waffles into production process in the mixing department in the month of June. Therefore, if we add these two quantities together, 100,000 plus 800,000, then we have 900,000 total physical units. Now we're going to take this a step further because, again, we've got to try to figure out what is the cost related to the number of waffles, the mix of them, that needs to be transferred on to the next department. And then what is the cost related to any waffles, the mix thereof, that is not 100% complete yet. But that's why it's still here in work in process. So we've got to calculate out what's still here and what's gone, and also assign costs to those quantities. All right, so 700,000 of the 900,000 were 100% of the way completed in the month of June and transferred on to the next department, while the remaining 200,000 units of the 900,000 are still here in work in process in the mixing department. All right, so if we add those two numbers together, it does in fact check off the 900,000. So we had 900,000 to account for, and we've got 900,000 accounted for, okay? But notice that 700,000 is what is transferred out, while 200,000 are still here. The second part of information, you need to make sure that you understand what's going on here. Now, when we talk about materials, we are going to keep it really simple in this class, and we are going to use the assumption that whenever we have product placed into work in process, that we are immediately going to put all of the materials required for them in the process at the beginning. So with that said, 100% or all of the direct materials are being put in at the beginning of the period or when those items are put into production. So regarding work in process, the 100,000 units that have been here since May, they already have 100% of their materials in play when they came over from May. And then we have started into production those 800,000 units. Those also have 100% of their materials, okay, because of the assumption that we're using. Now, let's talk now about conversion cost, because the conversion cost, again, is your direct labor and your manufacturing overhead elements. And this is where it gets a little tricky because we've got to calculate equivalent units, specifically for divvying up the conversion cost. We have got 100,000 units that came over from May that were only 70% of the way converted. Therefore, they need to be converted the rest of the way. And at the end of the month, we are leaving 200,000 units, and they are only converted 60% of the way. So we're going to utilize this information to come up with how far our number needs to go as far as equivalent units. Recall that we have already seen this particular slide here in regards to how we go about calculating equivalent units. If you need to take a moment and pause the video and review this slide, please do. But in short, what we always need to do is take our actual physical units and calculate equivalent units by taking that quantity and multiplying it by the percentage that those units are complete. So here we're using 1,000 physical units at 40% completion as to conversion. So 1,000 times 0.4 equals 400 units. So let's review the information given with our example here for Kellogg. In regards to the units, 700,000 of them have been transferred out, and the remaining 200,000 of them are still in work in process. But what we need to do is calculate equivalent units as to materials and equivalent units as to conversion cost, so that we can use those equivalent units to help us calculate a cost per unit. So let's first look at the column for the materials. All 700,000 of those units that were completed and transferred out did in fact receive 100% of their materials. 100% times 700,000 units means 700,000 equivalent units as to materials. And then for the work in process units, the 200,000 units that are still here in WIP for the mixing department, they too, based on our assumption, received all 100% of their materials. Because we are going to make the assumption in this particular class, and on your homework, they should all be the same, that when we place items into production, they receive all of their materials when they're first placed into production. So 200,000 times 100% means that 200,000 equivalent units are there for materials for the items that are still in WIP. So if we add those two together, 700,000 plus 200,000, we have 900,000 equivalent units as to materials. Now for our conversion costs. The units that are being transferred out have also been 100% of the way converted or manufactured or produced. They're 100% done as to whatever it is that this particular department does. Okay, so the mixing department, it has been completely mixed up, ready to go onto the baking department. So 700,000 units, actual units, times 100% means 700,000 equivalent units as to conversion cost. But then we've got those 200,000 units that are still in work in process. And they are only 60% of the way converted. They need another 40% in order to be finished. Therefore, we need to calculate equivalent units using our formula, 200,000 actual units times 0.6 for 60%, to give us 120,000 equivalent units. We can then add these two numbers together to give us 820,000 equivalent units as to conversion. So notice, folks, because we have some work in process that's remaining that is not finished as to conversion, is the reason why our equivalent units for materials is 900 and our equivalent units for conversion cost is only 820. Again, conversion costs, we are going to spread the labor and the overhead across these 820,000 equivalent units. And we're going to spread the materials cost across all 900,000 equivalent units. Notice here that it's stating beginning work in process is not part of the equivalent units of production formula. If you all were having to do both the FIFO and the weighted like we do in our advanced managerial course, this would make a little more sense to you. All right, so review this formula. Units completed and transferred out. Under our weighted average method, they have received 100% of their materials. Calculate that. 100% times the actual quantity equals the number of units completed and transferred out as to materials. And then add it to the equivalent units for the ending work in process materials. Again, our assumption is that 100% of their materials are given to them when they're started in production. This can be more involved. But hopefully every single homework problem and test problem that you're going to see is going to use 100% of materials when the items are placed into production. All right, so calculate that number, add the two together, and that's the equivalent units of production as to materials. Regarding our conversion costs, the units that have been completed and transferred out have been completed 100% of the way. So take that 100%, multiply it times the number of actual physical units, and you can calculate this number. Adding it to the equivalent units for the ending work in process. This is the one that's a little hairier. How far have those actual units that are still in work in process, how far have they been completed? That percentage needs to be multiplied against the physical units in order to calculate equivalent units. Once you've done that, take these two numbers, add them together to get the equivalent units of production as to conversion cost, just like we have seen on the slide just before this one. With our production cost report, we will put together the steps that we have seen onto the actual report. It is a key document. It shows us the cost and the quantities for each particular department. So we'll do one of these for every single department, and then we can use this information to evaluate and monitor. We follow the 4 steps. We're going to compute the physical unit flow. We've talked about this. We had 100,000 to begin. Those came over for May. We started 800,000 in the month of June for a total of 900,000. We then needed to compute the equivalent units of production. We have just seen that. We had 900,000 as to materials and 820,000 as to conversion costs. And then we would utilize the information that was given to us in the data set to calculate our production cost. Under the weighted average method, it's pretty simple, but if we were looking at the FIFO method, it's a little more complicated. We would have the total production cost broken down into 2 distinct categories, the materials and then the conversion costs. And again, the conversion costs are for labor and the manufacturing overhead. And then once we fill out the form, we can get to the bottom and we can literally reconcile and make sure that we have covered everything in detail. So the raw materials gets divvied up into the different departments. Again, using our assumption, 100% will be put in whenever units are started into those particular departments. Factory labor will be kept up with, and we will make sure that everything is being done properly. Okay, let's now review the data that was given to us in addition to the cost data. All right, so we started out June 1 with some work in process in the mixing department. This work in process came over from May. It was 100,000 units or 100,000 waffles worth of mix. 100% of the eggs and flour and sugar that were needed for 100,000 units was brought over in the direct materials for those in the work in process. And when those 100,000 units came forward from May, they were 70% complete. Therefore, they had conversion costs and they had materials costs that were brought forward from May. And that information is actually given to us down here. For their direct materials, 50,000, and for their conversion up to 70% was 35,000. Therefore, for the balance sheet as of May 31st, for work in process for the mixing department alone would have had a balance of $85,000, which of course it's an inventory account. It is an asset. It would be a debit. these 100,000 waffles need to be mixed the rest of the way, another 30%, before they can be sent on to the baking department. And then during the month of June, we started an additional 800,000 more units, putting in 100% of their required materials into the mixing department. All the eggs, all the flour, all the sugar, etc., etc. Therefore, they are 100% as to direct materials. And if we take 100,000 in beginning WIP and add it to 800,000 units started in June, you would have a total of 900,000 that are physical units. And we know that we have been told 700,000 of those have been 100% of the way completed as to mixing and have been transferred out to the baking department, and that only 200,000 of those are still here. And those 200,000 units are 100% complete as to materials, as we had discussed. They are part of the 900,000 that are still here. So they got 100% of their materials. But they are only 60% of the way converted. During the month of June, they've converted 60% of the way. They're going to get finished the remaining 40% in July. In regards to cost incurred during June, 400,000 is incurred for the direct materials of the 800,000 that were put into production in June. And then we have 170,000 total in conversion cost that were incurred. And again, that's the labor and the manufacturing overhead just for the month of June. Now, what did this 170,000 cover? It covered taking these 100,000 units and converting them their remaining 30%. And so many of the 800,000, 600,000 to be specific, 100% of the way converted. And then a remaining 200,000 of those 800,000 converted only 60% of the way. So that is why we are going to take this 170,000 in conversion cost and add it to this 35,000 in conversion cost for a total of 105,000. And we're going to spread that 105,000 across the 820,000 equivalent units as to conversion cost. And then regarding the materials, we're going to take the 50,000 plus the 400,000 and spread that across all 900,000 equivalent units as to materials. So, step 1, compute the physical unit flow, and we have done that. We had 100,000 to begin with, 800,000 started in the month of June for a total of 900,000. If we add those two numbers together, that is our total units to be accounted for. It was our 100,000 units started plus the 100,000 units in production at the beginning, plus the 800,000 units started in the month of June. This is how Wiley is showing us this on this particular PowerPoint slide. I personally prefer to think of it in the order that these items appeared in production. So I tend to like to use beginning work in process plus units started. So if you would like to rewrite it, that's what I would recommend. It's easier to think about that way if you think about it in consecutive order. For our total units accounted for, we are going to be able to take the units that were transferred out. That was 700,000 of the 900,000, plus the units that are still left in work in process at the end. So the ending WIP units, 200,000. That equals 900,000. The total units to be accounted for equals the total units actually accounted for. So 100,000 plus 800,000 equals 900,000, and 700,000 plus 200,000 equals 900,000. We can use these numbers to make sure that we are doing all of our calculations and our steps correctly. All right, so here's what that looks like calculated out. We have just gone through that step by step. You can pause it and review it if you would like. And here is step 2. We have already talked our way through this one. Again, we've got the equivalent units calculations as to the percentage of completion and how much in materials they have received. So 700,000 times 100% as to materials equals 700,000 in materials equivalent units. And then the 200,000 that are left in working process have also received 100% of their materials for 200,000, for a total of 900,000 equivalent units as to materials. And then conversion costs, those 700,000 units that are being transferred out are 100% of the way completed or converted as to mixing. Therefore, 700,000 equivalent units shows there. But those 200,000 units that are still in work in process are only 60% of the way as to conversion. So 120,000 is our equivalent units there, which brings us to 820,000 as to conversion costs. And these numbers are going to be the denominator for us here in just a moment. Calculating the unit production cost, we're going to take the total materials that have been incurred to date for the mixing department. We're going to take the beginning WIP materials and add it to the materials that have been incurred in the month of June. And we're going to take the conversion cost from the beginning WIP number brought over from May and add that to the conversion cost for June to give us total conversion cost. So, for the materials calculation only, the direct materials brought over from May was 50,000, and we had another 400,000 incurred in June. Adding those two together, we've got a total materials cost of 450,000. We're then going to take that and divide it by the equivalent units. And thankfully, due to keeping it simple, all materials were received when the units were began. So that's 100% as to materials for the total quantity, which resulted in 900,000 total units. We've seen this twice now. Taking the $450,000 divided by 900,000 in equivalent units for materials, we get a per unit cost for materials at 50 cents each. And we're going to use this number to calculate cost of materials for the 700,000 units that were transferred out to the next department, or even possibly to finished goods, depending on what your homework questions or test questions could be asking you. And we're also going to use that 50 cents per unit to help us with calculating the WIP ending inventory value for those 200,000 units that are still here. As to conversion costs, we had 35,000 that was brought over from May, and we incurred another 170,000 in June for a total of 205,000. And that 205,000 is going to be divvied up across the equivalent units, not the actual physical flow number, not the 900,000, but the 820,000. So total conversion cost 205 divided by the 820,000 equivalent units as to conversion cost. And recall that this is not 900,000 because those 200,000 were only 60% of the way as to conversion. If you perform this calculation, you would get 25 cents per unit, and this 25 cents is going to help us calculate the conversion cost for the 700,000 that are transferred on, and for the 200,000 units that are still here. But recall that those 200,000 units are only 60% of the way complete. So we're going to use the equivalent units number times the 25 cents to help us calculate our ending work in process number. All right, so we've got our per unit cost broken down for materials and for conversion, and we can then take and calculate the cost to manufacture per unit as 50 cents and 25 cents, materials plus conversion, to a total of 75. Now this is something we're going to want to keep a look at over time. If this materials cost keeps going up, managers, marketing people, hey, what can we do about this? Is this something that we need to try to pass on to our customers, raise our prices because our material costs are going up? Or hey, again, managers, entrepreneurs, is our cost going up because we're inefficient in our use of materials? Do we need to talk to procurement about the cost? What's going on? Things that we need to look at. What about our unit conversion cost? Are we inefficient in our conversion? Are we incurring some costs for things that's too high? What can we do? We can dig into these numbers here, watching them over time. We're going to use the 75 cents to help us with our totals. Regarding the cost to be accounted for, again, we had 50,000 and 35,000 for materials and conversion cost for a total of 85,000 brought forward from May as our work in process. And then we incurred another 400,000 in materials plus 170,000 in conversion cost in the month of June for a total of 570. Therefore, if you add these two together, we have got to make sure that we cover in our calculations all $655,000 worth of those costs. How are we going to plot out our calculations? 700,000 units are transferred out. They get 50 cents as to materials and 25 cents as to conversion, for a total of 75 cents. Therefore, 525,000 is attached to those units. And we are going to credit them out of this work in process mixing department account and debit them on into the next account. So this happens to be the first work in process department. It's going to get debited into the second work in process department, the baking department. But what if we were looking at the last department being utilized? We would be debiting them into finished goods inventory at this juncture. Regarding the work in process units that are still here, recall that we had 200,000 of them. They're 100% as to their materials, so their equivalent units was 200,000 times 50 cents equals $100,000 in materials. But regarding conversion costs, they were only 60% of the way completed, So their equivalent units is 120,000 at 25 cents equals 30,000. And this right here, folks, is the step that you've got to make sure that you do not mess up. Do not say 200,000 units at 0.25. That is incorrect. All right. Once you add up, 100 plus 30 equals 130,000 here. If you add these two together, you've got 655,000. That is, in fact, all of the costs that we just looked at, and we are divvying them up. This $130,000 number would show up as the work in process mixing balance as of June 30th. Debit balance, because work in process inventory is an asset account. And we can literally prepare this production report right here. So notice that step 1 is up here, step 2 is here, step 3 is here, and step 4 is here. And I need to somehow get it where you can see this last part. There we go, 655. All right, so notice that we do have a total row down here at 655,000. So let's look through this report really quick here and see that the words mean something. You guys need to go through and make sure that you understand not just the calculations of the numbers, but the words actually utilized in this form. All right, so recall that I said that we would do one of these reports for every department. So here we've got the mixing department, their production cost report for the month ended June the 30th, 2014. And we have got the units to be accounted for. These are the actual physical units. Work in process June 1, 100,000 units were brought forward from May. In the month of June, we started another 800,000 units. Add those two together to give us the total physical units. Now, regarding the units to be accounted for, we know that we transferred out 700,000 units. So 700,000 goes here. And work in process, we know that we had 200,000 still in work in process at the end of June. So 200,000 goes here. 700 plus 200 equals 900. 900 equals 900. Therefore, check mark, check mark. We're good to go there. But step 2, we need to utilize this information here and the conversion information in order to do step 2. All right, so as to materials, those 700,000 units received 100% of their materials, so 700,000 is the result. And these 200,000 units, as to materials, are also 100%, so 200,000. So equivalent units as to materials is 900,000. And then as to conversion costs, the units that were transferred out are finished. They're 100% of the way converted. So 700,000 times 100% converted equals 700,000. But these 200,000 that are still here were only 60% of the way converted. So 200,000 times 0.6 equals 120,000 equivalent units as to conversion. So 700,000 plus 120,000 equals 820,000. Now step 3 is where we totaled our cost and calculated our equivalent units and the unit cost. So total cost brought forward. This was 50,000 from beginning WIP materials, plus $400,000 in materials for June. For conversion costs, we had $35,000 as to conversion from beginning WIP brought from May, plus $170,000 incurred in June. We added those together to give us $205. $450 plus $205 equals $655,000. We then pull the equivalent units number from here and put it under the materials, and the equivalent units from conversion cost and put it here under the conversion cost, and calculate our unit cost per equivalent unit. 450,000 divided by 900,000 was 50 cents. 205,000 divided by 820,000 was 25 cents. Our per unit cost during this month was 75 cents, which is these two numbers added together. Again, we could follow these period after period and we'll evaluate them. Our cost to be accounted for, again, we're looking at this to add up our $655,000. This $85,000 was our beginning WIP brought from May. This $570,000 was the materials plus conversion incurred in June for a total of $655,000. This number and this number should match. And then we are reconciling and showing the numbers that are going to follow these inventoriable items. Regarding the 700,000 units that were finished and transferred on, 75 cents per unit for 525, and the 75 cents includes materials plus conversion. It came from here. Our work in process June 30th, 200,000 units are still here. As to materials, they get 50 cents per unit. 200,000 equivalent units times 50 cents equals 100,000. And they're only 60% of the way converted, which gave us a result of 120,000 equivalent units as to conversion cost. 120,000 times 0.25 equals 30,000. Do not mess up here and put 200,000. These numbers are equivalent units as to materials and as to conversion cost. These two added up equals 130,000. 525 plus 130 equals 655. Let me drop that down some so you can see it better. And again, this 655 matches this 655, which also matches this 655. So 130,000 is what would show for ending WIP on the balance sheet for the mixing department. And this 525 would be debited into the baking department and credited out of WIP for mixing. If we were in the last department of a process, it would be debited in the finished goods inventory and credited out of the particular department. And lastly here, regarding final comments, we have now seen job costing plus process costing, and let it be known that there are many companies out there that actually use a combination of a process cost and a job order cost system. It's called operations costing, and it's a hybrid system. It is utilizing the fact that there is a standardized production method in order to manufacture items, but at the same time, the products may have some type of customized or individual features that require the use of a job order cost system. So let me give you an example. What if we were the Lazy Boy furniture company and we put together sofas on a particular production line or plant that we own? And we put those sofas together in the same process, but the materials that we use are different. So some of them may have leather, some of them may have some very high-end fabric, and some others may have some cheap fabric. Some of them may have oak legs, some of them may have mahogany legs. There's going to be a price difference there in those components. Some of them may not have any trim put on them whatsoever. Some of them may have nail head trim put on them. Right, so we would be keeping up with all of the costs, just like we've seen in the process costing, and we're also going to keep up with the very specific additional attributes cost as well. So we could blend these two systems together, this process costing and job costing, and utilize it to do a better job of tracking our cost.